The phone in Bumpy Johnson's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue rang at 11:43 p.m. on September 8th, 1954. His wife, Mamie, answered. Bumpy was out that evening, meeting with policy operators at a social club on 147th Street. The voice on the other end was male, white, and deliberately slow, as if savoring each word. "Tell your husband he needs to reconsider his position on the West Side territories. Tell him some people don't appreciate him expanding where he's not wanted. And tell him." The voice paused, and in that pause, Mamie felt her stomach tighten. "Tell him that his daughter Ruth is a beautiful girl. 12 years old, right? Goes to PS 139 on 140th Street. Will be a shame if something happened on her walk home." The line went dead. Mamie stood frozen, the phone still pressed her ear, her hands shaking. In 20 years of being married to Bumpy Johnson, she'd learned to navigate the dangers that came with his business. She'd accepted bodyguards, changed routines, lived with the constant awareness that enemies existed. But this was different. This wasn't a threat against Bumpy. This was a threat against their 12-year-old daughter. She called the social club immediately. Bumpy was back at their apartment within 17 minutes, his face tight with an emotion Mamie rarely saw. Not anger, which he'd learned to control decades ago, but something colder. Something that looked like calculation mixed with barely contained rage. "Who was it?" he asked, his voice level. "I don't know. White man, not local accent. Maybe Italian, maybe not." He knew Ruth's schedule, knew her school, knew which way she walks home. Bumpy was silent for approximately 30 seconds, processing this information with a strategic mind that had kept him alive and powerful for over 3 decades. Then he made 3 phone calls, all brief, all cryptic, all to people whose names Mamie didn't recognize. By midnight, 6 men were stationed within a 3-block radius of their apartment building. By 1 a.m., Ruth had been moved to stay with Bumpy's sister in the Bronx, under the protection of 2 trusted associates who'd been instructed to maintain 24-hour surveillance. By 2 a.m., Bumpy had contacted 17 different sources across Harlem, the Bronx, and parts of Manhattan, trying to identify who'd made the call. By September 10th, just 48 hours after that phone call, the man responsible for the threat, along with his entire family, would be fleeing New York in the middle of the night, desperate to escape consequences that had materialized faster and more completely than anyone could have anticipated. But here's what made this story remarkable. Bumpy Johnson never laid a hand on the man who threatened his daughter, never fired a shot, never ordered a beating, never engaged in any of the direct violence that people associated with gangland retaliation. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He demonstrated that after 25 years of building power in Harlem and beyond, he'd accumulated enough influence, enough connections, enough strategic leverage that he could destroy someone's entire life. Their business, their reputation, their family's safety, their future, through nothing more than information, pressure, and the systematic activation of debts owed and relationships cultivated. What happened over those 48 hours would become a case study in how power operates in the shadows, how threats can backfire catastrophically when directed at someone who understands the invisible architecture of fear, obligation, and consequence better than almost anyone in New York's criminal underworld. The phone call on September 8, 1954, was supposed to intimidate Bumpy Johnson into surrendering territory. Instead, it triggered a response so precise, so overwhelming, and so utterly devoid of traditional violence that it would be remembered for decades as an example of what happened when someone fundamentally misunderstood who they were threatening. But to understand how Bumpy dismantled his enemy's entire life in 2 days, you need to understand who made that call, why they thought threatening Bumpy's family was a viable strategy, and what the territorial dispute was really about. Because this wasn't random mob violence. This was a calculated attempt to drive Bumpy out of expanding operations by attacking his most vulnerable point. It failed spectacularly, and the man who made it paid a price that had nothing to do with bullets and everything to do with the systematic destruction of everything he'd built, everyone he cared about, and any future he thought he had in New York. To understand the threat against Bumpy's family, you have to understand what was happening in New York's organized crime landscape in 1954, particularly the battle over West Side Manhattan territories that had been simmering since early that year. By September 1954, Bumpy Johnson was 59 years old and had been operating in Harlem for over 3 decades. He controlled approximately 43 policy banks across Upper Manhattan, employed over 300 people in various capacities, and generated an estimated annual revenue of $4.2 million. His arrangement with the Italian crime families, negotiated back in 1938 and modified several times since, had held relatively stable. Bumpy paid approximately 22% of gross receipts to the Genovese family in exchange for territorial protection and political connections. But in early 1954, something had changed. West Side Manhattan, the area roughly from 59th Street to 110th Street, between 8th Avenue and the Hudson River, had become valuable in ways it hadn't been before. Urban development was transforming the neighborhood. New apartment buildings were going up. Middle-class residents were moving in. And with them came new opportunities for policy operations, loan sharking, and various other enterprises that existed in the gray space between legal and illegal. Bumpy had begun expanding into these territories in March 1954, opening 5 new policy banks and establishing relationships with local business owners who needed capital or protection. It was a natural extension of his Harlem operations, and technically, it didn't violate his arrangement with the Genovese family. The original territorial boundaries had specified north of 125th Street as his primary domain, but they'd never explicitly forbidden expansion elsewhere in Manhattan. However, West Side Manhattan was also home to operations run by various other criminal organizations, including remnants of the old Irish gangs, some independent Italian operators who didn't answer to the 5 families, and crucially, a crew run by a man named Vincent "Vinny Knuckles" Colucci. Colucci was 41 years old in 1954, born in Brooklyn, affiliated loosely with the Colombo crime family, but operating semi-independently. He'd been running policy operations, protection rackets, and loan sharking on the West Side since 1948, building what he considered his exclusive territory. By 1954, his operation generated approximately $800,000 annually, a significant sum, but nowhere near Bumpy's scale. When Bumpy began expanding into the West Side, Colucci initially tried diplomatic channels. In May 1954, he'd requested a meeting through mutual contacts, suggesting they could divide territories to avoid conflict. Bumpy had agreed to meet, and on May 23rd, they'd sat down at a neutral location, a restaurant in Midtown, to discuss the situation. According to witnesses who were present, the meeting had been civil but unproductive. Bumpy's position was straightforward. The West Side was open territory, not controlled by any of the 5 families, and therefore available for anyone who could successfully operate there. Colucci's position was that he'd been there first, had established relationships and operations, and deserved recognition of his prior claim. They'd reached no agreement. Bumpy had continued expanding, and Colucci had grown increasingly frustrated. Between June and August 1954, tensions escalated through a series of minor confrontations. 3 of Bumpy's policy runners on the West Side were beaten by men believed to be working for Colucci. One of Colucci's loan sharking operations was undercut when Bumpy began offering loans at better rates. A storefront Colucci used as a front business mysteriously failed a building inspection and was forced to close for 3 weeks. These were the usual moves and counter-moves of territorial disputes, not yet violent enough to trigger serious retaliation, but enough to signal that conflict was intensifying. By early September, Colucci was facing a problem. Bumpy's expansion was succeeding. Customers preferred dealing with Bumpy's operations, which had better payouts and more reliable service. Business owners chose Bumpy's protection because it came with actual benefits, capital when needed, mediation of disputes, connections to legitimate businesses. Within 5 months, Bumpy had captured approximately 40% of the West Side market that Kalachi had previously controlled. Kalachi needed a game changer, something that would force Bumpy to retreat without triggering a full-scale war that Kalachi couldn't win. He knew he couldn't match Bumpy's resources or connections. He couldn't count on support from the Colombo family. They had their own arrangement with the Genovese family and wouldn't risk that relationship to back Kalachi's territorial claims. So he decided to go after Bumpy's family, not to actually harm them. Kalachi later insisted he never intended to follow through, but to threaten them in a way that would force Bumpy to choose between business expansion and family safety. It was a catastrophic miscalculation based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who Bumpy Johnson was and what he'd built over 25 years. Kalachi assumed that threatening family would make Bumpy cautious, defensive, willing to negotiate from weakness. He didn't understand that Bumpy had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of threat, building networks specifically designed to protect against attacks that came from unexpected angles. More importantly, Kalachi didn't understand that in making that phone call on September 8th, he wasn't just threatening Bumpy's daughter. He was violating an unwritten rule that governed organized crime in New York. You didn't target families unless you were prepared for total war. And Kalachi wasn't prepared for anything close to that. The phone call was made at 11:43 p.m. on September 8th. By 2 a.m. on September 9th, Bumpy had identified Kalachi as the likely source through a combination of informants, logical deduction, and the fact that Kalachi had been sloppy. The call had been made from a pay phone in Kalachi's neighborhood, at a time when several witnesses saw someone matching his description. And once Bumpy knew who was responsible, the question became not whether to respond, but how. Violence was always an option. Bumpy certainly had the resources and the justification. But violence was also messy, unpredictable, and likely to trigger responses from the Italian families who preferred stability over bloodshed. So Bumpy chose a different path, one that would be more devastating, more permanent, and more perfectly calibrated to destroy everything Kalachi valued without firing a single shot. Over the next 48 hours, he would demonstrate exactly what 25 years of strategic relationship building could accomplish when focused with surgical precision on a single target. Vincent Kalachi woke up on the morning of September 9th, 1954, feeling satisfied. He'd made the threatening call 12 hours earlier, and now he waited for Bumpy Johnson to reach out, to negotiate, to show the kind of concern for family that would make him vulnerable. Kalachi lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, with his wife Maria and their 3 children, Vincent Jr., age 14, Anthony, age 11, and daughter Sophia, age 8. He maintained this suburban facade carefully, presenting himself to neighbors as a business consultant who worked irregular hours in Manhattan. His wife knew the truth, of course, but she'd learned not to ask questions, to accept the money he provided, and to maintain the respectable appearance that protected them all. His West Side operation was run from a social club on 72nd Street, employing approximately 18 people in various capacities: policy runners, collectors, enforcers, and administrators. It was a profitable business, but also fragile, dependent on relationships with specific business owners, cooperation from specific beat cops, and the tacit acceptance of larger criminal organizations that could crush him if they chose to pay attention. What Kalachi didn't know as he ate breakfast that morning was that Bumpy Johnson had already identified him as the source of the threat and was, at that very moment, beginning a systematic campaign to dismantle his entire operation. The first move came at 9:17 a.m. Detective James Sullivan from the NYPD's West Side Precinct, the same Sullivan who'd helped Bumpy in the 1947 incident on 139th Street and who'd been on Bumpy's payroll for years, received an anonymous tip about illegal gambling operations at a social club on 72nd Street. The tip included specific details: the layout of the club, the names of key operators, the schedule for when money was counted and moved. Sullivan was smart enough to recognize the source of the tip, and smart enough to understand that Bumpy Johnson didn't make requests like this unless he had good reason. A raid was organized for 2 p.m. that afternoon. At 2:14 p.m., 12 police officers entered Colucci's social club with a search warrant. They found approximately $14,000 in cash, detailed records of policy operations, and evidence of loan sharking. 6 men were arrested, including Colucci's brother-in-law, who served as his second-in-command. The raid alone wasn't devastating. Raids happened, arrests were made, bail was posted, and operations resumed. But it was the first crack, the first indication that something had shifted. The second move came at 3:45 p.m. Colucci received a phone call from his landlord, who owned the building where the social club operated. The landlord, a man named Abraham Cohen, who Colucci had been paying $600 per month for 3 years, informed him that the lease would not be renewed when it expired in 30 days. No explanation, no negotiation, just a flat refusal to continue the arrangement. What Colucci didn't know was that Cohen had received a visit that morning from 2 men who'd made it clear, politely, professionally, without explicit threats, that continuing to rent to Colucci would create problems. Not problems from them specifically, but problems with city inspectors, problems with licensing, problems with the kinds of things that could make a landlord's life very difficult. Cohen didn't know who these men worked for. He didn't need to. He understood the implicit message and made the practical decision. The third move came at 6:30 p.m. 3 of Colucci's regular policy players, business owners who ran numbers games in their stores and kicked up percentages to Colucci, suddenly stopped taking action. When Colucci's runners came by to collect, they were told, apologetically but firmly, that they were switching to a different operation. Why? Because they'd received offers from Bumpy's organization that were simply better. Higher payouts for winners, more reliable service, protection that actually protected. But more than that, they'd heard rumors, vague, unconfirmed, but persistent, that Colucci had done something that made him radioactive, that associating with him was becoming dangerous. How had these rumors spread so quickly? Through the invisible network of shop owners, runners, and community members who existed in the space between criminal operations and legitimate business. A word here, a suggestion there, delivered by people whose judgment was trusted, and suddenly everyone knew that Colucci was trouble. By 9 p.m. on September 9th, less than 24 hours after his threatening phone call, Colucci's operation had been raided, his base of operations had been lost, and his revenue stream was collapsing. But he still didn't understand what was happening or why. That night, he called an emergency meeting with his remaining crew at a diner in Brooklyn. 8 men showed up, down from the usual 12, for had simply vanished, suddenly unreachable, having made the calculated decision that working for Colucci had become too risky. Somebody's moving against us, Colucci told them, his frustration evident. The raid was too well-informed. The landlord flip was too sudden. The players switching operations, all of it happening at once. This is coordinated. You think it's Johnson? One of his men asked. Colucci hesitated. The timing was suspicious. The campaign against him had begun within hours of his threatening call. But this didn't look like Bumpy's usual style. Where was the violence? Where were the direct confrontations? This felt different, more like systematic pressure than gangland retaliation. Even if it is, Colucci said, he can't sustain this. We'll move the operation to a new location, find new players, rebuild what we lost. It's a setback, not a defeat. But even as he said it, he felt uncertain. Because something about the precision of what was happening, the perfect timing, the multiple pressure points activated simultaneously, suggested a level of coordination and reach that exceeded anything he'd anticipated. At 11:30 p.m., Colucci went home to Bay Ridge, exhausted and worried, but still believing he could weather this storm. His wife Maria was waiting up, which was unusual. "Vincent, 2 men came by the house this afternoon," she said, her voice tight with fear. "They asked me questions about the children's schools, their schedules. They were polite, said they were conducting a survey, But Vincent, they knew too much. They knew Anthony plays baseball on Thursdays, that Sophia takes dance lessons, that Vincent Jr. walks home from school alone. The color drained from Kelechi's face. Now he understood. This wasn't just about business pressure. Bumpy Johnson was sending a message. You threatened my family. Now feel what it's like to have yours threatened. Except Bumpy's approach was far more sophisticated. No direct threats, just the demonstration that he could access Kelechi's family as easily as Kelechi had accessed his. But the realization came too late. Because while Kelechi was finally understanding the nature of his situation, Bumpy Johnson was already executing the next phase of his campaign. The phase that would make staying in New York impossible for Kelechi and his entire family. September 10th, 1954, began with Vincent Kelechi discovering that his problems had multiplied overnight in ways that moved beyond his business and directly into his personal life. At 7:15 a.m., his wife Maria received a phone call from the principal at their daughter Sophia's elementary school. There had been complaints from other parents about the Kelechi family. Unspecified complaints, nothing concrete, but enough that the principal felt obligated to mention that the school took the safety and welfare of all students seriously. The implication was clear. The Kelechi family was being watched, and their presence at the school was now controversial. At 8:30 a.m., Kelechi's bank called. His business account, the one he maintained for his consulting firm as a front for his operations, was being flagged for suspicious activity. A routine audit would be conducted, requiring him to provide documentation for all deposits and withdrawals over the past 6 months. This wasn't technically an accusation of anything, but it was an impossible request. There was no way to document the sources of his illegal income, and attempting to do so would create evidence that could be used against him. At 10:45 a.m., 2 FBI agents appeared at Kelechi's door in Bay Ridge. They didn't have a warrant, weren't making any accusations, just wanted to ask a few questions about his business activities, his associates, and his travel patterns over the past year. The questions were probing but not aggressive, creating a record of federal interest without triggering grounds for a lawyer to shut down the conversation. Kelechi answered carefully, providing minimal information, but the message was received. Federal authorities were now paying attention to him. Why? He had no federal cases pending, no reason to be on the FBI's radar, unless someone had put him there. By noon, Kelechi understood that he was facing something unprecedented in his experience. A coordinated, multi-front attack that was using legitimate authorities, business pressure, and social isolation simultaneously. This wasn't gang warfare. This was sophisticated dismantling of everything he'd built, using systems he couldn't fight back against. At 1:30 p.m., he received a phone call from his cousin Tony, who worked as a shop steward in the Longshoremen's Union. Tony's message was brief. Vinny, word's going around the docks that you're radioactive. Nobody's supposed to work with you. Nobody's supposed to help you. I don't know where it's coming from, but it's spreading fast. You need to fix whatever you did, or you're finished. This was the most devastating blow yet. Kelechi's operation depended on relationships, with union guys who could move goods without documentation, with dock workers who could make things disappear or appear as needed, with a network of working-class Italian and Irish men who formed the backbone of New York's criminal infrastructure. If he was being blackballed from that network, his ability to operate was essentially zero. He couldn't rebuild elsewhere in the city because the same networks existed everywhere. And if the word had spread this quickly, it would follow him wherever he went. At 3 p.m., Kelechi did something desperate. He called for a meeting with representatives from the Colombo crime family, hoping they would intervene, protect him, or at least explain what was happening. The meeting was granted for 4:30 p.m. at a restaurant in Little Italy. 2 men showed up, Anthony Tony Lombardo, a capo in the Colombo family, and his associate, whose name Kelechi never learned. They sat across from Kelechi in a back booth, their expressions neutral but not friendly. You wanted to talk, Lombardo said. Talk. Kelechi explained his situation, the raid, the lost territory, the pressure on his family, the sudden blackballing across the docks. "I need help," he concluded. "I need the family to back me up, to tell people I'm under your protection." Lombardo was silent for approximately 15 seconds, then leaned forward slightly. "Let me explain something to you, Vinny. You threatened Bumpy Johnson's daughter. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" "It was just a threat. I wasn't going to—" "Doesn't matter," Lombardo interrupted. "You crossed the line, and now Bumpy's demonstrated that he can destroy you without violence, which makes him look reasonable and makes you look weak. The family's not getting involved. You brought this on yourself. But I'm associated with you," Kelechi protested. "If I go down, doesn't that reflect badly?" "You're not associated with us," Lombardo said flatly. "You operate independently. You pay us tribute sometimes when it's convenient, but you're not family. And right now, backing you would mean problems with the Genovese family, who have arrangements with Johnson. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave New York. Tonight. Tomorrow at the latest. Take your family, go somewhere else, start over. Because if you stay, Bumpy's going to keep squeezing until you've got nothing left, and eventually you'll do something stupid that forces him to respond violently. And then we'll have a mess nobody wants. Leave." Kelechi's voice cracked slightly. "This is my home, my operation, my life." "Was your life," Lombardo corrected. "Past tense. Make the smart choice, Vinny. Disappear while you still can." The meeting ended at 5:05 p.m. Kelechi walked out of the restaurant in a daze, understanding finally that he had no allies, no protection, and no future in New York. But there was one more twist coming, one final demonstration of how thoroughly Bumpy Johnson had dismantled Kelechi's world. At 7:30 p.m., as Kelechi sat in his Bay Ridge home, trying to explain to his wife that they might need to leave the city, there was a knock on the door. Kelechi opened it to find a well-dressed black man in his 50s, someone Kelechi had never seen before. "Mr. Kelechi," the man said politely, "my name is Raymond Torres. I work for Mr. Johnson. He asked me to deliver a message." Kelechi's hand moved instinctively toward his waistband, where he kept a pistol. Torres noticed and smiled slightly. "I'm not here for that. I'm here to help you understand your options." "What options?" Kelechi said bitterly. "Your boss has destroyed everything. He's demonstrated what happens when you threaten his family," Torres corrected. "But he's also willing to let this end here. You leave New York, tonight, preferably, and the pressure stops. Your family stays safe. You get to rebuild somewhere else. But if you stay, if you try to retaliate, if you do anything except disappear, then what you've experienced over the last 48 hours was just the opening move." "Where am I supposed to go?" Kelechi asked, the desperation clear in his voice. Torres handed him an envelope. "There's $5,000 in there. Enough to get you and your family to Miami, or Las Vegas, or Los Angeles, somewhere outside the Northeast. Mr. Johnson doesn't care where, as long as it's far from his operations. Consider this a gift. You made a mistake, you're paying for it, but he's offering you a way out that doesn't end with you dead or in prison." He turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Johnson wanted me to tell you one more thing. He never touched your family, never would have. That's not how he operates. But he wanted you to feel what you made him feel, that his family was vulnerable. Now you understand. Don't make the same mistake twice." Torres walked away, leaving Kelechi standing in his doorway with an envelope containing $5,000 and the ruins of everything he'd built over 6 years on the West Side. At 11:47 p.m. on September 10th, exactly 48 hours after his threatening phone call to Mamie Johnson, Vincent Kelechi loaded his wife and 3 children into their car, along with whatever belongings they could pack quickly, and drove out of New York heading south. They settled eventually in Miami, where Kelechi found work in legitimate construction and spent the next 15 years living quietly, never returning to criminal operations, never mentioning the name Bumpy Johnson, and never, ever threatening anyone's family again. The question everyone who heard the story asked was the same. How did Bumpy Johnson orchestrate such complete destruction in just 48 hours? How did he coordinate police raids, landlord pressure, business defections, social isolation, federal attention, and organized crime abandonment all simultaneously, all targeting one man, all without obvious violence? The answer revealed something fundamental about how Bumpy had built power over 25 years. He'd invested in relationships across every system that mattered in New York, creating a web of obligations, favors, and mutual interests that could be activated when necessary. Start with Detective Sullivan and the police raid. Bumpy had been paying Sullivan and approximately 7 other police officers across Manhattan for over a decade, not just for protection, but for information and occasional assistance. The payments were regular, the relationships were stable, and when Bumpy needed a raid conducted on Colucci's social club, Sullivan had every professional and personal reason to comply. The tip was anonymous, the evidence was solid, and the raid was entirely legitimate from a legal standpoint. The landlord situation was more complex. Abraham Cohen, who owned the building housing Colucci's social club, had no direct connection to Bumpy. But he had a connection to someone who had a connection to someone who owed Bumpy a favor. The chain was 3 people long, but each link was strong enough that when pressure was applied at one end, it transmitted effectively to the other. The business defections, policy players switching from Colucci to Bumpy's operation, were partly economic. Bumpy's organization genuinely offered better terms, but also social. Bumpy had spent years cultivating relationships with West Side business owners, providing loans when banks wouldn't, mediating disputes, investing in community improvements. When word spread that Colucci had done something that made Bumpy respond forcefully, these business owners made rational calculations about which side to be on. The FBI attention was perhaps the most sophisticated move. Bumpy had a contact, someone high enough in federal law enforcement that they could ensure certain information reached the right desks, who owed him for help provided during a previous investigation. A tip about potential organized crime activity on the West Side, delivered through proper channels, was enough to trigger routine investigation. No laws were broken, no false accusations were made, just information flowing through systems designed to respond to such information. The union blackballing happened through similar channels. Bumpy had relationships with several Black and Hispanic union members across New York's docks and construction trades. These weren't people who worked for him directly, but people he'd helped over the years: legal assistance, loans, intervention in disputes. When word went out that Colucci was problematic, it spread through informal networks faster than any official communication could have. And the Colombo family's refusal to protect Colucci? That was the result of the arrangement Bumpy had maintained with the Genovese family since 1938. The 5 families generally avoided internal conflicts, and when a lower-level independent operator created problems with someone who had formal arrangements with another family, the smart move was to cut the independent loose rather than risk larger complications. Every single pressure point Bumpy activated existed because he'd been building these relationships for decades. None of them were created in response to Colucci's threat. They already existed, waiting to be used if necessary. This was the genius of Bumpy's approach. He didn't need to maintain a large organization of violent enforcers. He just needed to be valuable to enough people across enough systems that when he asked for assistance, people provided it gladly, knowing that reciprocity would work both ways. But there was something else, something more psychological in Bumpy's response. By demonstrating that he could access Colucci's family, sending men to ask questions, making the threat implicit rather than explicit, Bumpy had shown Colucci exactly what he'd done to Bumpy, but without crossing the legal or ethical lines that would have justified violent retaliation. It was brilliant strategic restraint. Bumpy had every justification to respond violently to a threat against his daughter, but by choosing nonviolent systematic destruction instead, he denied Colucci any grounds for counter-retaliation while demonstrating power far more impressive than bullets would have shown. And the $5,000 he'd given Colucci through Raymond Torres? That was the final psychological blow. Charity for an enemy, demonstrating that Bumpy was wealthy enough, secure enough, and magnanimous enough to help the man who'd threatened his family, as long as that man accepted total defeat and permanent exile. Within a week of Colucci's departure, Bumpy had consolidated complete control of West Side Manhattan policy operations. Former Colucci players signed on with Bumpy's organization. The territory that had been contested became unambiguously Bumpy's, and the message sent to other potential rivals was unmistakable. Threatening Bumpy Johnson's family was not just wrong, it was suicidal. But here's what's remarkable. Despite the devastating effectiveness of his response, Bumpy never bragged about what he'd done, never publicized it as a warning to others. The story spread through underground channels, told and retold in social clubs and barbershops, becoming part of the legend of Bumpy Johnson, the man who could destroy you without touching you, who'd built power so comprehensive that challenging him meant challenging every system you depended on simultaneously. It was a demonstration that power in mid-century America didn't just flow through violence or money, but through relationships, information, and the patient accumulation of influence across every structure that mattered. And it all happened in 48 hours, triggered by one phone call that crossed one line that should never have been crossed. Vincent Colucci disappeared from New York on the night of September 10th, 1954, and for most people involved, that was the end of the story. He'd threatened Bumpy Johnson's family, suffered devastating consequences, and chosen exile over destruction. Simple cause and effect. But the aftermath revealed layers of complexity that made the incident more than just another gangland power play. It became a case study in restraint, strategy, and the long-term benefits of building power through networks rather than fear. First, consider what didn't happen. Colucci wasn't killed. His family wasn't harmed. Despite having every justification for violent retaliation, threatening a man's 12-year-old daughter was universally considered grounds for lethal response in organized crime culture. Bumpy chose a different path. This restraint wasn't weakness. It was strategic brilliance. By destroying Colucci's life without killing him, Bumpy denied the Colombo family any reason to seek revenge, avoided police attention that always followed mob murders, and demonstrated a kind of power that was actually more frightening than violence would have been. Because violence says, I can hurt you. But systematic dismantling says, I can erase you. I can take away your business, your home, your family's safety, your future, your allies, everything you've built, and leave you alive to understand how completely you were outmatched. Within 2 weeks of Colucci's departure, Bumpy received overtures from 3 other criminal operators in different parts of Manhattan, all seeking to negotiate territorial arrangements rather than risk conflict. The Colucci incident had provided a demonstration of Bumpy's reach that was far more effective than any amount of violent intimidation would have been. But there was something else happening, something that revealed Bumpy's long-term thinking. He used the Colucci incident to strengthen relationships across every network he'd activated. Detective Sullivan and the other officers who conducted the raid received bonuses, not explicitly connected to the raid, but timed suspiciously close. The landlord Abraham Cohen, who'd terminated Colucci's lease under pressure, found that various city inspections of his properties became notably smoother over the following months. The business owners who'd switched from Colucci to Bumpy's operation received improved terms and additional services. Every person who'd helped Bumpy destroy Colucci was rewarded, reinforcing the message that cooperation with Bumpy paid dividends. This wasn't just about one enemy. It was about strengthening the entire network for future needs. The FBI agents who'd questioned Colucci were an interesting case. They'd been acting on legitimate tips, conducting routine investigation, unaware that they were part of a larger campaign. But after Colucci left New York, someone, possibly Bumpy's high-level federal contact, ensured the investigation was closed quickly with a notation that the subject had relocated and posed no further concern. The agents wasted no time, filed their reports, and moved on to other cases. By late September 1954, less than 3 weeks after the threatening phone call, Bumpy had consolidated his West Side operations, strengthened his relationships across law enforcement and business communities, and established a reputation for strategic thinking that made him one of the most respected figures in New York's criminal underworld. But what about his family? How did the threat affect them? Ruth Johnson, Bumpy's 12-year-old daughter, had been moved to her aunt's apartment in the Bronx immediately after the threat. She stayed there for 3 weeks under constant protection, attending a different school temporarily. Bumpy and Mamie visited daily, but they'd made the calculated decision that separation was safer than having Ruth at home while the situation with Clutchy was being resolved. When Ruth returned home in early October, she did so with an understanding that many children her age never developed, that her father's business created risks, that protection was necessary, that normal childhood freedom wasn't always possible. It was a heavy burden, but Bumpy and Mamie tried to make it manageable, explaining things honestly while providing as much normalcy as circumstances allowed. Years later, in interviews conducted after Bumpy's death, Ruth would say, "My father never lied to me about what he did or why our lives were different from other families. He explained that he'd built something valuable, that valuable things attracted danger, and that protecting our family was his first priority. When that man threatened me, I was terrified. But watching how my father responded, not with violence, but with strategy, taught me that power doesn't always look like what people expect." Mamie Johnson's perspective was more complicated. She'd lived with Bumpy's criminal career for over 20 years by 1954, had accepted the risks, had built a life around the reality of who her husband was and what he did. But the threat against Ruth had crossed a line that shook her in ways previous dangers hadn't. In a later interview, she reflected, "I understood my husband's work. I knew there were risks. But when someone threatened our daughter, I wanted Bumpy to kill them. I wanted immediate, violent revenge. Instead, he spent 48 hours systematically destroying this man's entire life. At first, I thought he was being too measured, too strategic. But then I saw what he'd done, how completely he'd dismantled this person without firing a shot. And I understood. Violence would have felt satisfying for a moment, but what Bumpy did was permanent. He didn't just defeat one enemy. He demonstrated to every potential enemy that threatening our family was the worst strategic decision they could possibly make. The broader organized crime community took notice. Within 6 months of the Clutchy incident, Bumpy received overtures from operators in Philadelphia, Detroit, and even Chicago, all wanting to understand his methods, to learn how he built such comprehensive power without depending primarily on violence. Some of these operators tried to replicate Bumpy's approach, building relationships across legitimate systems, cultivating connections with police and politicians, investing in communities. Most failed because they didn't understand that Bumpy's network had taken 25 years to build and couldn't be replicated quickly. But a few succeeded in creating similar structures, demonstrating that Bumpy's model, power through relationships rather than fear, was viable in other cities with different demographics and power structures. The incident also had unexpected effects on Harlem itself. Business owners who'd heard the story felt more confident dealing with Bumpy's organization, knowing that he protected his people and their families with the same ferocity he'd demonstrated in defending his daughter. Community members saw Bumpy not just as a criminal operator, but as someone who embodied a particular kind of strength, the ability to defend loved ones absolutely, while maintaining the strategic discipline to avoid unnecessary violence. It's worth noting that what Bumpy did to Clutchy wouldn't be possible in exactly the same way today. Modern surveillance, digital communications, and more rigid separation between criminal operations and legitimate institutions would make the kind of coordinated, multi-system pressure Bumpy orchestrated more difficult to achieve without detection. But the principles remain relevant. That power built through relationships is more sustainable than power built through fear. That strategic restraint can be more devastating than overwhelming force. and that understanding systems well enough to manipulate them is worth more than any amount of direct violence. Vincent Colucci lived in Miami until his death in 1983. He never returned to criminal operations, working in construction and real estate development. According to family members, he never spoke about his time in New York or why he'd left. His children grew up knowing nothing about their father's past, the threat he'd made, or the consequences he'd suffered. And Bumpy Johnson? He continued operating in Harlem until his death from a heart attack in 1968, 14 years after the Colucci incident. By the time he died, he'd become something between a criminal legend and a community leader, someone whose methods were complicated, whose morality was ambiguous, but whose effectiveness at protecting his territory and his people was undeniable. The story of Colucci's threat and its 48-hour aftermath became part of the oral history of Harlem, told and retold in barbershops and social clubs, simplified and mythologized, but always carrying the same core message. Don't threaten Bumpy Johnson's family unless you're prepared to lose everything you've built and flee the city with nothing but charity money from the man you threatened. It wasn't the most violent story in organized crime history. It wasn't the most dramatic or sensational, but it was perhaps the most instructive, a demonstration that in mid-century New York, the most dangerous people weren't always the most violent. Sometimes they were the most strategic, the most patient, the most skilled at understanding how systems worked and how to make those systems work for them. The phone call on September 8th, 1954, was supposed to intimidate. Instead, it became a teaching moment, not just for Vincent Colucci, but for anyone paying attention to how power actually operates in complex social systems. Here's what Colucci misunderstood. He thought power was about position, territory, and a willingness to make threats. He'd built a decent operation on the West Side, controlled some lucrative territory, and believed that threatening Bumpy's family would force a negotiation from weakness. But Bumpy understood power differently. To him, power was about relationships, networks, and the ability to activate multiple pressure points simultaneously. It was about having done favors for so many people across so many systems that when he needed assistance, people provided it gladly. This difference in understanding explains why Bumpy could destroy Colucci in 48 hours, while Colucci couldn't have done the same to Bumpy even with months of planning. Colucci had employees, people who worked for him because he paid them. Bumpy had a network, people who helped him because he'd helped them, because they respected him, because being part of his network provided benefits beyond immediate payment. Colucci had territory, geographic space where he operated. Bumpy had influence, the ability to affect outcomes across multiple territories, industries, and social systems. Colucci thought in terms of immediate tactical advantage. Bumpy thought in terms of long-term strategic positioning. The threat against Ruth Johnson revealed all these differences brutally. When Colucci made that call, he was executing a tactic without understanding the strategic landscape. He didn't know that Bumpy had relationships with police officers who could raid his operation, landlords who could evict his business, union members who could blackball him, federal agents who could investigate him, and crime family leaders who would abandon him. More importantly, Colucci didn't understand that all these relationships already existed, ready to be activated. Bumpy didn't have to build anything new to respond. He just had to make phone calls to people who were already inclined to help him. This is the critical lesson. Sustainable power isn't built through fear or force. It's built through making yourself valuable to others, through helping people when they need help, through being someone that others want to be connected to rather than someone they're forced to obey. Bumpy had spent 25 years building this kind of power. He'd loaned money to businesses when banks wouldn't. He'd mediated disputes that could have turned violent. He'd provided capital for community improvements. He'd helped dozens of families through difficult times. He'd positioned himself as someone who solved problems rather than creating them. All of this was strategic, calculated to build networks of obligation and reciprocity. But it was also genuine, Bumpy understood that the most effective strategy was to actually help people, actually provide value, actually make their lives better in some way. When he needed to destroy Kolucci, he didn't call in favors reluctantly given. He called in favors gladly provided by people who remembered his help and wanted to reciprocate. This approach to power, building it through relationships rather than fear, has applications far beyond organized crime. It's how political movements succeed, how businesses build loyalty, how communities organize resistance against external threats. The civil rights movement that was gathering momentum in 1954 operated on similar principles, building networks across communities, creating relationships that could be activated for collective action, demonstrating that coordinated resistance could achieve what individual defiance couldn't. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a civil rights leader. He was a criminal operator whose methods were often exploitative and whose business depended on activities that harmed some of the same communities he claimed to protect. But he understood something that transcended his criminal context. That power built through making yourself valuable to others is more sustainable than power built through making others fear you. The Kolucci incident demonstrated this principle perfectly. Bumpy could have killed Kolucci. That would have been traditional mob justice. But killing him would have created new problems. Police attention, potential retaliation from Kolucci's associates, a reputation for excessive violence that might make future enemies more likely to strike preemptively rather than risk negotiation. Instead, Bumpy showed that he could destroy Kolucci completely without violence. Using systems that Kolucci depended on, through relationships Kolucci didn't know existed. It was a more impressive demonstration of power than any amount of violence would have been, and it came at relatively low cost. The raid on Kolucci's operation was legitimate police work. The landlord's lease termination was within legal rights. The business defections were market choices. The FBI investigation was routine procedure. The union blackballing was informal social pressure. None of it created legal liability for Bumpy. None of it could be traced back to him definitively, and all of it was reversible if circumstances changed. This is sophisticated power, exercised indirectly, through multiple systems, in ways that achieve objectives without creating excessive risk or drawing unwanted attention. 48 hours. One threatening phone call turned into complete destruction, exile, and a lesson that echoed through organized crime circles for decades. Don't threaten Bumpy Johnson's family unless you understand exactly who you're dealing with and what he's built over 25 years of strategic relationship building. Vincent Kolucci never understood until it was too late. But everyone who heard the story understood afterward, and that understanding shaped behavior, deterred threats, and maintained order more effectively than any amount of violence could have achieved. That's the paradox at the heart of this story. The most devastating retaliation was the one that avoided bloodshed. The most impressive demonstration of power was the one that operated invisibly. And the most effective deterrent wasn't fear of death. It was fear of systematic destruction so complete that death might have been preferable. One phone call, 2 days, and a lesson in power that remains relevant 7 decades later. Build relationships. Invest in networks. Make yourself valuable to others. And when you need to respond to threats, you'll have resources that violence alone could never provide.